During the next few moments, I want to share with you the historical legacies of our two political parties. History tells us that one party was formed in 1792 and established a legacy of lies, lynching, and litigation that literally destroyed the lives of millions of blacks. And this party called themselves Democrats. The other party was formed in 1854, approximately 150 years ago. And they established a legacy of supporting life, liberty, and legislation that will enhance the lives of African Americans. And this party called themselves Republicans. One party became known as the Party of Lincoln. The other party became known as the Party of Lynchings. From 1863 to 1983, the following facts established their legacies. In 1863, while the Democrats fought and gave their lives to expand slavery, Republicans fought and gave their lives to ban slavery. History tells us that while the Republican Party supported the 13th Amendment to eliminate slavery in every state, Democratic Party supported the enforcement of fugitive slave laws to confiscate slaves in the northern states. In 1868, when the Republican Party introduced the 14th Amendment to make black citizens, the Democratic Party had consistently supported the Dred Scott decision, which made blacks property. When the Republican Party introduced the 15th Amendment to give blacks the right to vote, the Democratic Party introduced armed guards and rigid testing requirements to deny blacks the right to vote. In 1866, when the Republican Party introduced the 1866 Civil Rights Act to protect blacks, the Democratic Party introduced the Ku Klux Klan to terrorize blacks. In 1867, when the Republican Party introduced the 1867 Reconstruction Act to establish fair governments in states controlled by Democrats, the Democrats responded with the black codes to nullify these acts. In 1870, when the Republican Party introduced the Enforcement Act of 1870 to enforce Democrats to comply with the new civil rights laws, Democrats responded by introducing new legislation at the state level to counteract these laws. In 1871, when the Republican Party opened up hearings on the Ku Klux Klan Act, those who took the witness stand testified that the Democrats worked very hard to regain control of the South. And in their efforts to gain the upper hand, the Democrats became the daddy of the Ku Klux Klan. In 1875, when the Republican Party passed the 1875 Civil Rights Law to prohibit racial discrimination in places of public accommodations, the Democratic Party not only had this new law overturned by the United States Supreme Court, but they exercised their states' rights and introduced a new system called Jim Crow, a system that affected the courtrooms, the classrooms, and caused racism to grow. To oversee a new Republican program, and they call this program Affirmative Action. In 1983, with the support of several senators from his own party, 72 Democrats voted against it. It was during this period that Republican President Richard Nixon hired an African American by the name of Art Fletcher to oversee a new Republican program, and they called this program Affirmative Action. In 1983, with the support of several senators from his own party, as well as over the objections of racist Democrats and Senator Jesse Helms, Republican President Ronald Reagan signed into law a bill making Dr. Martin Luther King's birthday a legal national holiday. Yes, history tells us that the Democratic Party and the Republican Party have two distinct legacies. The Republican Party's legacy includes the abolitionists, the NAACP, black colleges, the Emancipation Proclamation, and a multitude of civil rights legislation. The Democratic Party's legacy includes fugitive slave laws, black codes, the Dred Scott decision, Jim Crow laws, and the Ku Klux Klan. After completing my research on the legacies of both political parties, I had to ask myself, how can anyone pledge their loyalty to a political party whose legacy includes lies, lynching, litigation, and legislation that destroyed the lives of millions of blacks? That's when I decided to document my findings in my book, Unfounded Loyalty, an in-depth look into the love affair between blacks and Democrats. Not only did I write the book about my findings, but I also wrote the Democratic Party. And I'd asked the Democratic Party to apologize for the things that they did to African Americans from 1792 to 1962. After their refusal to respond to the letters, I decided to take them to court. On December 10th, 2004, I filed a multi-trillion-dollar reparations lawsuit against the Democratic Party. In my 100-page brief, I highlighted a multitude of racist practices that had a profound impact on African Americans from 1792 to 2002. In my brief, I told the court that in an effort to impede and deny African Americans the same constitutional rights afforded to all American citizens, the Democratic Party established a pattern of practices by promoting, supporting, sponsoring, financing racially biased entertainment, education, legislation, litigation, and terrorist organizations from 1792 to 1962, and continued certain practices up to 2002. The Democrats' 210 years of racist practices and cover-ups not only negatively affected the entire black race, but these practices infected the entire nation with the most contagious and debilitating social disease known to mankind, called racism. With landmark litigation, racist legislation, profane defamation, Democrats spent substantial amounts of money to produce racist campaign literature and to support racist entertainment like the Jim Crow minstrel shows, stage plays like The Klansman, and the great movie The Birth of the Nation, all in an effort to prove to the world that African Americans were a racially inferior group that should be treated and classified as property and not as people. Finally, during the past 21 decades, the Democrats successfully disguised and concealed their horrific acts against African Americans by operating and committing these acts under a multitude of aliases. Aliases, names like the Confederacy, Jim Crow, Black Codes, Dixiecrats, and the Ku Klux Klan. Congressional records and historical documents and letters and testimonies from several brave black citizens reveal that these weren't separate, independent organizations, but they were actual auxiliaries and divisions and or the legislative efforts of the Democratic Party. The debates on the Ku Klux Klan Act of 1871 further reveal that these auxiliaries were committed to use any means possible, including lynchings, murder, intimidation, mutilations, decapitations, and racially biased legislation to carry out their agenda of white supremacy. We submitted our book as one of the exhibits in the case that has the actual congressional records showing every civil rights law from the 13th Amendment all the way up through the 1972 Equal Opportunity Act that the Democrats oppose. Their actual debates against these civil rights bills are part of the congressional records that we included in the book. It is so unfortunate today that most of our people have a very biased history. We call it revisionist history that fails to tell African Americans and people in general the truth about our history. I feel that the federal government, when the first reparation case was filed against the federal government, that was the wrong entity to file the case against. Because when you study history, you'll find that the federal government consistently tried to launch various investigations in the practices of the Democratic Party and the kinds of horrific acts that they were committing against African Americans. But it was Democratic elected officials in the South that blocked the investigation every time. Senate Bill number 60 was a bill to give African Americans 40 acres and a mule. It was a done deal. We wouldn't be talking about reparations today had the Democratic president at that time signed the bill into law. Democratic President Andrew Johnson vetoed Senate Bill 60. That's why we're still talking about reparations today. Every effort to stop blacks from having the same rights as white citizens was the proud work of the Democratic Party. When discussions come up in history books, my two sons are here, and when they take history, they come home and they talk to Dad about it. They'll say that Congress passed the 13th Amendment. Technically, they're right, but it was a Republican Congress that passed the 13th Amendment because the southern states had still, many of the Democratic states were still in secession, and they had not come back to the Union. And the Northern Democrats, we have that information in the book, the Northern Democrats were debating against the passage of the 13th Amendment. So when the history books say that Congress passed the 13th Amendment, they don't want to tell you the full truth. What they should say is the Republican Congress passed the 13th Amendment. What I've learned, and I was just like Jesse Jackson and most of the other African Americans and citizens as a whole, I voted Democrat all my life. This was one of the first years that I ever voted for Republicans after doing this research, because I assumed that the Democrats were the party for African Americans. That's what the newspaper says. You turn on CNN, CBS, all the major networks, they say that blacks are Democrats and we should vote Democrat. But they failed to tell the truth about history. They failed to tell the truth about even the modern day Democratic Party. But none of the papers picked it up. You see, there's always been a conscious effort by certain white people, and I think most of them were the Democratic Party. And it's not to say Republicans never had racist members, because they did. The difference between the Republican Party and the Democratic Party is that the Republican Party always had members in their party that challenged the racist members of their party. See, the racist members of the Democratic Party has always been challenged. They had Thaddeus Stevens, you had Charles Sumner. These are people that African Americans should know, and most likely you Republicans should have statues of Thaddeus Stevens and Charles Sumner. They were the foundation of the Republican Party. These people were not compromised. These were the men that forced Lincoln to do many of the things that we're giving Lincoln credit for. Pro-African Americans, they fought for the cause of African Americans. In the Democratic Party, the racist members of the Democratic Party were always promoted up to lead the party. No one ever challenged them that what they were doing was racist. Over 500 1,000 men joined the Ku Klux Klan after watching that racist film produced by D.W. Griffiths, whose father was a colonel in the Confederacy, and Thomas Dixon, who was the actual stage playwright that wrote the play that inspired the film. Thomas Dixon was a Democratic state representative who believed that blacks were inferior to whites, and if you gave blacks equality, if you read the agenda of the Democratic Party, they consistently said, if you give blacks equality, they're going to take our white women. It is considered by the film historians as a classic. And see what the film depicts, and how the Ku Klux Klan saved America from those power-hungry blacks that took over the South, who passed legislation to marry white women. That never happened. But whites believed it, just like you believe the Democratic Party is a pro-black party because you read it in the newspapers, because you saw something on TV. You believed it, but you didn't check it out yourself. Well, the same thing happened in 1915 when they watched the birth of the nation, which opened again, Black History Month, February 1915. They opened in Los Angeles, California. When they opened in February 1915, Klansmen on horses, fully arrayed in their white attire, covered the whole entire theater, while people lined up to see that particular movie. That movie appeared for 44 weeks in New York alone. And every place where that movie was released, whites broke out with riots and beat blacks as random, because the racist practices that were initiated and promoted by the Democratic Party has infected the entire nation and continues to affect African Americans today. And I think that if we're going to file a case for reparations, we should go after the people who committed the crime.
You can comment on those two.
I appreciate your question. Let me be very honest with you. The Democratic Party today is not the same Democratic Party of yesterday. They don't practice the outright, overt, discriminatory practices. And a number of them do not have a racist bone in their body. At the same time, the Republican Party is not the same party as it was of yesterday. The party of yesterday, Republicans gave their lives for blacks. Today, most white Republicans won't even talk to blacks. And there would not be a Republican Party if there wasn't a black problem. Because in 1854, 20 men were upset with the Democrats' racist practices, and they decided to form the Republican Party with one agenda. And that's to see to it that blacks had every right as whites. That was your party's original agenda. Now in 2005, you don't hardly have white Republicans talking to blacks. So both parties have changed. Although we talk about the legacy of both parties, we find that both parties today are not the same parties of yesterday. And I think that both parties have a lot of areas to improve in. While the Republicans may criticize Democrats on social issues, there's no dialogue between Republicans and blacks to even talk about the issues that are affecting African Americans. Thaddeus Stevens, Charles Sumner, William Herndon, they would turn over in their grave if they saw the Republican Party today that distanced themselves from the people that they gave their lives to emancipate. But I don't see the Republican Party reaching out. By the same time, I see the Democratic Party, as Al Sharpton so rightly put it, treating blacks like they're the mistress, like the Democratic Party is the pimp and blacks are the prostitutes. And all they're saying is, black, bring us your vote. They're not saying vote for us and advise us. They said vote for us and shut up and go away and let us do what we want to do. And so there needs to be a whole change in this whole structure. I don't think, I'm neither Democrat nor Republican, and I will not. My boys are Republican. They swear up and down they are. But I am not Republican. I am independent. I'm a Christian. I'm a minister. I have to go according to my values. Did you know without Republicans, there would be no 13th Amendment, 14th Amendment, and 15th Amendment? The three most powerful amendments that we know of that allows people to have citizenship and rights regardless of their race, color, or creed? It was Republicans. The Democrats opposed that. There's so much for you to be proud of and to launch on to, connect with, and carry out the legacy of those people who died to create the party that you now claim that you're members of.